Welcome to another edition of the Reconciliation Conversation podcast. We want this to be a space where we can expose hate, encourage love, equip for healthy reconciliation, and emphasize unity so that all people can know their value together as one. My name is Derrick DeLain, and I'm here with my good friend Jason Dukes. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well, man. I'm doing well. And some of our listeners may know you are in transition, or about to be in transition. Yes. And so you've been carrying a lot. And so let me say publicly, thank you for taking a few minutes to do what you do and how well you do it with us on this today, bro.
Man, that means a lot, Jason. Yeah, we're transitioning to Nashville literally. So next week we move out of our house. And so if I turn my computer around right now, boxes on boxes all over the place. But we're excited about getting out that way, man. So well, listen, I'm excited for our guest today. We have Pastor Alan Cross. He is an amazing man, as I was kind of looking him up a little bit. Highly respected in the church and journalistic and historical and government circles for his insights on race in the South and immigration culture. He is actually currently a pastor just north of San Fran. He's an op-ed writer for the New York Times, author of When Heaven and Earth Collide, Racism, Southern Evangelicals, and a Better Way of Jesus. He's also a contributor for Bulwark Online, Christianity Today, RNS, Providence Mag, Time, and MGM Advertiser. This guy is doing everything, and he's way better than both of us combined. So Pastor Alan Cross, my man, thank you for joining us today.
Man, I appreciate that. Reject all of of your final conclusion, but I'm very happy to be with you guys for sure.
Listen, when you got it like that, man, we're gonna recognize it. You know what I'm
saying? Just do the thing and see what happens.
He's not gonna flex, so we'll flex for you. That's what it is.
Love it. Well, listen, I want to jump right in, and man, you know, as a matter of fact, as I was thinking about this question. I was like, you know, Derrick, like you're going to expose yourself a little bit here. And I was like, you know what, I think our listeners, they need to see that level of vulnerability and transparency. So I wanted to jump in because, man, this is going to expose some of my racial bias in this question. So Alan, I want to ask you as a white guy, what first got you interested in matters of race and immigration? And the reason why I ask that and why I say it exposes my bias. I'm just curious why, you know, white men are thinking about this, you know, older white men, especially in the context where I grew up. I just didn't see that. And so, man, I want to hear from you. Why is it this something that you know, interests you?
Yeah, and I don't feel that much older, but I guess it's starting to happen. You know, I'm a 45, and so I was born in the 1970s in New Orleans, and you know, my family, we had family in South Mississippi, so moved when I was 5 years old. Didn't realize it was white flight, but that's what it was. You know, we were trying to get out of the city, and you know, my parents wanted to send me to public schools in a small town that was mostly white, Picayune, Mississippi, where I grew up. And so I just grew up in the South in Mississippi. I loved history and loved you know, exploring the past. I had ancestors who fought for the Confederacy, and you know, I ran across that they owned slaves, and wasn't proud of that. But you know, I would wave the Confederate flag and all that. And then really in my mind, it was really just regional. You know, just regional pride. Like I didn't connect it. Like I knew slavery was bad, knew racism was bad, and I didn't connect it, you know, what it all meant. It was more of like, yeah, I'm proud to be from the South, and I'm proud to be from Louisiana and Mississippi. And that was as far as it went. But I loved history. We'll go visit Civil War battlefields and plantation houses, and you know, look, you know, how beautiful this is and how great it is, and you know, thinking about you know, the Confederate gray line marching, and all of it just seemed very romantic and you know, wonderful. And you know, would read about Gettysburg and was sad that the South lost, and like, you know, whenever people say that it's heritage, a lot of people really do mean it. Like, you know, you can study it and go into it and just never make the connection to what this was really about. And because I did that for years. I did that into my 20s. I studied history at Mississippi State, where I went to college, and I, of course, you know, read about civil rights history. I was trained to teach it in public school, but wasn't thinking about it in full. Went to seminary out at Golden Gate Baptist Theological Seminary out in California, in the late 90s and was trained to think like a missionary, and began reading the Bible that way, and started thinking about culture and started thinking about contextualization and barriers and bridges to the gospel. And that's when I think, and I really loved people. I mean, I was doing homeless ministry and working with people of all different races and backgrounds. And then I moved to Montgomery, Alabama. So that was the first church that I worked in, where I was for almost 20 years and stayed in the same church for most of that time. And I began thinking like a missionary. So I got to Montgomery, even though it was in the South, I didn't take it for granted that I understood it, because every part of the South is different. So I started studying the background, and this was the first capital of the Confederacy. It was the birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement. And I wanted to understand it. And so that's when I really started doing, I had read a lot and knew a lot, but it was always from kind of like, I'm a white guy and that's Black history, and, that's where like February being Black History Month does a disservice, because it segments it all, everything's, it's all over here. And so I was able to segment it in my mind, because that's
a whole nother conversation, Al.
Yeah. Oh, I know. I'm telling you, I'm just getting started, right?
Man.
That sounds like we know what one of our February podcasts are going to be.
Come on, let's go. Let's go.
So I'm telling you all this because all of this background of me, I'm a Christian. I want to love all people. I know that racism is wrong, but just the whole framework that I'm raised in and everything that I see, I don't see or understand until I get to Montgomery in the early 2000s, 2000, and I begin to think like a missionary, or I'm thinking like a missionary, like I was trained to do theologically. And that's when it began to become clear. Okay, we were an all-white church in a rapidly transitioning Montgomery, where white flight was happening all over the place, and it was 50-50 white and Black, and white people were moving out, and Black people were becoming the majority. The part of town that we were in was the white part of town, and then you had all different races moving in, and we were still a white church. I'm saying, well, this can't be. We're supposed to reach all people. Like, I knew that biblically, but then in trying to figure out why we weren't and why we couldn't, I started listening, studying, exploring, and then I started doing this deep dive into history, which I've been trained to do with a history background, and then things just began to open up to me, and I'm like, oh my goodness, stuff I didn't know anything about. How did this happen in a city full of churches that claimed to be Christian in the Bible Belt? And this wasn't just the KKK writing. These were Christians. These were people claiming to be believers, and they were promoting this, and they had this doctrine. So there were no good answers. No white evangelicals, no white Southern Baptists were talking about this, period, anywhere. If you brought it up, if you went to a seminary and talked to a professor, you talked to SBC leaders, they all said, hey, we apologize, 1995. We're done. There's no point in talking about it anymore. Everything's fine. That's all in the past. And I was not satisfied with that. So I can be a bulldog about stuff. And the more that I studied, the more that I learned, the more that my mind began to change. And I realized, well, my understanding was just really surface level. And then I just started spending time with African Americans and pastors. It's a whole long story, but whenever I preach and speak in churches on this, I used to say that I was taught that all this was in the past, and we had just gotten over it. And it was that was just back then, and people didn't know any better. And so I thought like a child, but when I grew up and I learned to think like a man, then I began to realize there's a whole lot more to it than what happened. And that's where the book, I began researching and working on the book, When Heaven and Earth Collide, is my own journey to understanding this. And then, I wrote it after I think I had really worked all the way through the issue. It took about 10 years, but I wrote it on the back end of that. And to explore racism and Southern evangelicals and what is the better way of Jesus? How should we address this? So that's a long answer to a short question, but
no, but to be honest, I feel like that gives perspective for me. But then our listeners as well. It's just like, man, like, it's just not it could be an aha moment. But it takes time. And I think that actually speaks to kind of what's been going on. I've had a lot of people kind of challenge me a little bit or ask me questions like, well, why are you still having this conversation with people? Like it's just like, man, like people are listening now, and it's not a spiritual, I told you so. I've been saying this for years.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, I want it to be, but then it's like, nah, man, it takes time for people to have their eyes open, for the scales to be removed from the eyes. In the same way that Jesus, the word of God says, like, it's God's patience that leads to repentance, right? It's this long journey of people seeing that it's just like, yo, dag, I had a problem. There was something going on here in my own heart that I just never realized. And so I think even in that long answer, I think that's perfect.
Yeah. And some of that I told you so is important.
It's important.
No, not from you, but because, you don't want to get, private, but from others to go back and say, these folks were telling us, and we weren't listening. That was part of the problem. We were just pushing people away, or we thought we knew, and things like that. And I look back on things I thought I knew. But I grew up in the South, and I grew up playing basketball, and I was, I was the white guy out there trying to keep up on the court with guys running over me, and things like that. So I'd always been around Black people. But at the same time, I didn't understand the background and the history and what led to the situation that we're in right now.
Man, that's good. That's good. Thanks, Alan.
It's so good. Well, and you mentioned you ended up in Montgomery, and you were there. In fact, that's when, although you and I probably knew of each other or had background with your New Orleans background and the seminary and all that, but I think when I really first got to know you was when the guy I grew up best friends with became a student pastor with you, if I remember correctly. But you were there, man. You were in Montgomery. I've heard you give a lecture on this question that I'm about to ask you. And you started it, at least that day. I don't know if you do this every time, but at least that day you started it with the iconic picture that you could Google. Any of our listeners can Google and see it. And on the YouTube edition of this, I'll put the picture if Derrick is comfortable with it. I'll send it to him first. But it's a church building. Inside of a church building, you're looking at the front of the auditorium, and the KKK is lined up across the front of the auditorium.
Saves, I'm all the way
and it
okay
says
with
Jesus saves above them. And you start with that picture. It's an iconic, historic picture. You start with that picture, and the picture alone, for those that are really trying to wrestle with this issue, should break us. And that was the picture alone.
Yeah, it was taken in Oregon or something like that. It wasn't even in the South.
Wasn't even South. When I found that out, I was like, I said, boom, there you go.
Yeah.
The other day I was listening to a radio interview, and it was on a radio show that not all white conservatives listen to. I'll put it that way. And they were talking about that even still to this day in Minneapolis, there are clauses in real estate contracts that say white Caucasians are the only people that can dwell on this property.
Wow.
And I'm going, dang, like that's Minneapolis. Like this, that's not Montgomery, right? But your time in Montgomery, it shaped you just as much as what I just said shaped the people of Minneapolis, just as much as what happened today with the cops in Wilmington, North Carolina getting fired for racist remarks, because it's Wilmington, which was one of the most tragic massacres of Black individuals in our history, right? No wonder the demons of that still exist in that place, right? Like you think about it, Montgomery had to have a huge impact on you.
Yeah, it was. I was beginning to do my research, trying to find those barriers and bridges to the gospel in the South. I didn't go back there, being from the South, assuming that this was the Bible Belt and the Christian culture, and it really felt like in a lot of ways it isn't, and wasn't. It was a culture that had been inoculated against the gospel by getting a little bit of it, but not getting the whole thing. And so, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of resistance to the gospel that's built up over time. And so, how do you work around that? And one of the major, if not the major issue is race and racial division. I mean, when people say that there's not systemic racism, and then we look at our all white and all Black churches, like that's evidence that systemic racism still has an effect. Now, it doesn't mean that a Black family can go to a white church, or a white family can go to a Black church and be welcome. I think they, in large part would be, until you start getting into some of the details of culture and things like that, where people don't feel welcome. But at the same time, we are the way we are because of what happened in the past. And those ruts were dug, and those barriers were built, and they don't just fall down. Even if everybody changes their mind and you change all the laws, you still have the geography of culture is built in certain ways, and we unknowingly live in that. And so we travel those valleys, we climb those mountains, and they're there, and they've been built there for hundreds of years. And so again, just look at if you go to church, there's a good chance it's mostly white. There's a reason for that. It's not just personal preference. And so I'm in Montgomery and I'm learning these stories. And there's one story in particular that stuck out to me about when the Freedom Riders came to Montgomery in 1961, May 1961, and they were beaten in Anniston. The bus was burned in Anniston. They were beaten in Birmingham, and then they make their way to Montgomery. This is John Lewis. It's May 21st, 1961, and May 20th and 21st. They're beaten in Montgomery, and they flee. They end up the next day at First Baptist Church on Ripley Street, which is the historic Black Baptist church. There's a whole story behind that that's incredible. Ralph Abernathy is the pastor, and the Freedom Riders end up in there. All of the luminaries of the Civil Rights Movement came. Diane Nash came from Nashville. Martin Luther King flew in, or he came back from Chicago to Atlanta and maybe drove down. Fred Shuttlesworth comes from Birmingham. Ralph Abernathy. I mean, everybody's there. And it's about 1,500 people inside the church, led by Reverend Solomon Say from Montgomery, singing "Love Lifted Me." When nothing else could help, love lifted me. And a mob of about 3,000 white people surrounding the church, trying to burn the church down on top of them, throwing Molotov cocktails on the roof, breaking glass, throwing rocks through, turning cars over. Well, they turned a car over in the street owned by Virginia Durr, the wife of the civil rights lawyer there, who was a white lady, and she was working with them. But the car is on fire. The federal marshals have to come out. They're threatening to bring them. It was a national crisis. You have the White House on the line with the governor who wouldn't respond. This was horrendous. And I'm in Montgomery, and I go to the church, and there's a plaque out in front of it that tells the whole story. I never in my life had heard that story.
Nope.
Of 1,500 Black Christians in church, worshiping, singing, praying, preaching, with a mob of 3,000 white people surrounding it, trying to burn the church down on top of them. And I'm like, that's religious liberty. That's, blatant racism, all of the things. And so then, they're dispersed, and there's this big, the city of Montgomery was behind it. The state of Alabama was behind it. It was collusion with the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, this was state-sponsored terrorism. And then it was just over, and there were regrets expressed. There were, the business leaders in Montgomery said, hey, we shouldn't have violence. This isn't good for anybody, all this kind of stuff. But I began to wonder what kind of wounds were created in the white and Black, in the body of Christ when that happened. Why weren't there hundreds and thousands of white Christians coming down the street to protect their brothers and sisters in Christ who were in that church? And the reason why was because a lot of them were in the mob. They were in the crowd. Or they didn't care, or they didn't even know what was happening because they just, cover their ears and cover their eyes and weren't paying attention. So learning that story, and this was the early 2000s. This is when I first got to Montgomery. But that story was like, if you remember in The Matrix when Morpheus talks about a splinter in your brain driving you mad,
Yep.
That story was the splinter in my brain. And I could not look at the South. I couldn't look at Christian history in America. I couldn't look at race the same way again, because for that to have happened, and for it to have been allowed, and for a city in the South, in the Bible Belt, Southern Baptists and National Baptists and everybody all over the place, for it to get to that point, a whole lot of hell had to break loose for a long time before that. Yep. And then have we ever really repented from it? Have we ever really come out of it? And so, so that began the exploration. And so Montgomery is the epicenter. I believe that 100%. I hate having left there. I used to give city tours and explain all these things and walk in the streets of Montgomery. But if you want to learn the story, go to Montgomery and walk the streets. EJI has done amazing stuff with the Lynching Memorial and the Slave Museum. But it's the collision of race and culture and politics and religion and history all collide there. And that's where, the title When Heaven and Earth Collide came from. I have a picture of that church. I have the book, but on top of it, that's the church on Ripley Street, First Baptist. And the idea that heaven and earth colliding at this place is what came out. But the church was there. So the church didn't fail. And this is the other thing. We would ask, why did the church fail when it came to race? And I said that for years. Why did the church fail? And I hate that I framed it that way, because the church didn't fail. Black Christians were calling for truth and justice for a long time.
Facts.
I mean, the church was there. The church was telling the truth. The church was prophetic. The church was pointing to Jesus.
Yes.
There was a religious revival breaking out, and the rest of us didn't see it. And we said it was Marxism, it was communism, it was all of these leftist ideologies, and all they were doing was holding out scripture, and the rest of us couldn't even see. So I no longer say that the church failed when it came to race. I say the white church failed, but the Black church was getting it right, and we should have listened to them.
Man, that's good. That's really good, Alan. And you mentioned it. So I would say that there's maybe aspects of that in your book, maybe not, but even just hearing you now, as soon as we're done with this, I'm ordering that book. I have not read it, but I'm about to go on a vacation, and I'm reading that book, When Heaven and Earth Collide. So I would love to just kind of figure out or hear from you. What would you say are 2 takeaways from that book that you feel like best set someone up to want to go to purchase and read it, if they're not convinced yet with what you were just saying?
That's right.
Well, it's an exploration. So I start with a series of questions, and they're the questions that I heard, raised as a white Southern Baptist conservative pastor. There had been critiques written before of the white church from the left, or from people who had left white evangelicalism theologically, because they couldn't stay in it anymore because of the failures on race. I took a different approach where I said, it isn't the white evangelical church it isn't evangelical theology that is to blame per se. It's the way that we didn't apply what our own theology taught us. And so, how do we love our neighbor sacrificially? I mean, read Philippians 2:1-11, where if you have anything of Jesus at all, any comfort from him, any fellowship from the Spirit, like Christianity 101, like if you became a Christian 5 minutes ago and have anything from Jesus, then you should put the interest of others ahead of your own. You should count others better than yourselves. That's what it says. And so, like, this isn't a failure of our theology, it's a failure of application. And then our orthopraxy then affects our orthodoxy, right? So like our practice affects our theology. So eventually, if you don't practice it, you warp it, and then you shift it, and you say, well, it doesn't matter. So what I get at through a series of questions is I go back to the point in time where our theology was subverted to make allowance for this massive sin that was entering in. And it didn't come in through the church initially. It came in through economics and through, developing. I mean, it was money, and it was how do you have prosperity and developing or protecting your way of life, right? So so the underlying issue beneath it, and this is what I unfold over hundreds of years of history and a few hundred pages, is that racism is a symptom of a deeper issue, which is the drive to promote, protect, and defend your way of life. And that can manifest in a lot of different ways. And so once we overtly dealt with racism, and so I build this whole case, I'm kind of giving you a preview, but I build this whole case about how it all developed. And it comes to a head in the 60s overtly. But then when that's cut off by 1968, like legally you can't do this anymore because the law's passed, then instead of repenting, we just went underground and we just developed other ways to do the same thing. And so to Black people, it all looks like racism because we're doing the same things. White people say it's not racism because really what we're doing is we're just promoting family values, and we're just promoting, our own individual choice, and we're just kind of pursuing our own way of life. And that, and that is without concern for others. But we have those ridges and ditches and mountains that have been built because of hundreds of years of racialization. So even though we might, go out and just try to live life normally, as long as you're living for yourself and protecting your way of life in America, that's going to eventually flow racially, because that's where all of the river valleys have been created from the past. And so the book gives a way out of that, which is the better way of Jesus, which I unfold, which really is through sacrificial love, of laying down your rights and laying down your power, considering your neighbor, and then finding those places of pain and of brokenness that still exists because of history. Now, none of this is saying that the reader is a racist. I never say that. I have no idea where your heart is, but we all live in this racialized world, whether we like it or not. And you can be the most unracist person, but if you're not aware of the world that you live in and the ruts that have already been created that you just fall into, then you're not going to be able to navigate this missionally. So the cross is the way out of it, where you're constantly trying to think, how do I lay down my life and my rights for others so that people can be healed and so that we can speak the gospel into all of these things. So when I see protests and when I see these things happen, I grieve. But then my next thought is, how can I bring gospel healing to this? And it starts by listening. It starts by trying to hear what people are saying. And I still have a lot to learn. I definitely don't know everything. But instead of reacting against it and getting angry because, well, that's not me, I do think, well, why are people saying this? Why are people having these reactions to things? If I don't know, then I need to understand, right? And so the gospel causes me to lean forward into people's lives and into their pain, so that I can, not just be the teacher bringing Jesus, but so I can see where Jesus is already working and try to join him in that, to bring redemption there. So anyway, that's another long answer to a short question, but those are the promote and protect and defend your way of life is the underlying cause beneath all of this, and it manifests racially in America, in the New World, and then the cross, sacrificial love, and the application of the cross to Jesus is the answer. But then we have to apply that into society through sacrificial love. That's the other half of it. So
well, listen, number one, you don't need to apologize about a long answer, but two, like I said, I'm looking forward to opening that up, opening it up, and then being able to recommend it, man, because especially at a time like this, there are a lot of people asking me, man, what are some resources? I've got a running list that I'm constantly adding this things on, so I'm looking forward to being able to add this on there as well.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It's so good, man. And at the risk of saying something controversial, I mean, I think personal relationship with Jesus, right? That phrase, that I'm not against that phrase. I think we do have a personal relationship with Jesus, and I think what Jesus did was for me. But if I can't put that inside of the frame or the bottle of, or whatever metaphor I want to use, of what Jesus did for us collectively, of what it's an individual and a collective element. And that's so much of what I'm hearing you say, right? It's this shift. And so you almost wonder if the evil one duped the South into making it nothing more than a personal relationship with Jesus, and missing out on the collective nature of the implications of that. And I mean, Jesus said that, right? We'll love God and love your neighbor, right? I mean, it's not like it's bad theology. And so, I love that you're hitting on those things.
But in the South, it becomes bad theology because that develops.
Yes.
That actually developed so we wouldn't notice the rattle of chains around us. So that personal relationship with Jesus developed in the midst of massive collective sin. I tell a story. If you were a Christian in Montgomery, Alabama in 1835, 1836, and you walked down the street in 1836 after the last Creek War, where land speculators had come in and they were raiding the Creek lands, the Creek Indian lands, and they were pushing them to starvation. Finally, they rose up again and tried to defend themselves, and that was all that they needed for the U.S. Army to come in and crush them in the last Creek War. And then they were rounded up and put in concentration camps in East Alabama. Okay, and these were the first concentration camps, and they were held there. And then they were marched in chains from East Alabama, where those camps were, to Montgomery and put on boats. At the same time that 1,000 black slaves a day were being marched down the federal road to Montgomery to be sold and to be housed. It might have been 1,000 every day, but there was a report of a British traveler who counted 1,000 in one day during this time period that were marching down to be sold. So you had white Christians in central Alabama who were building plantations, and to do that they had to clear out the native peoples, and they had to import black slaves from other parts of the South as the Deep South was opening up. So if you were a Christian in 1836 walking down the streets of Montgomery, the rattle of chains was everywhere, from Creeks being marched out on the Trail of Tears, where thousands of them died, to African slaves being marched in. And you had to somehow deal with that. So your religion went private to just me and Jesus, because for it to be public on anything other than supporting this, it would get you thrown out of town. It wouldn't work. And so that me and Jesus thing, Charles Marsh in his book, God's Long Summer, he does an incredible expose on this. And in chapter 5 of my book, I explain all this. Douglas Hudgens, who was the pastor of First Baptist Jackson, Mississippi, was considered in the 1950s. He was the theologian of the South who helped everybody navigate this with a me and Jesus theology, so that they didn't have to deal with Freedom Summer. And they didn't have to deal with the Freedom Riders being locked in parchment and singing hymns from inside of the jail cells. And we're the governor of a Mississippi. The racist governor was able to teach Bible studies in his church, and he was at the same time locking up Freedom Riders because it was personal, it was individual. Mm-hmm. So whenever we say that it's good theology, it is in a sense, but the way it developed in the South was horrendous. And it developed for a reason. It didn't develop independent of all this mess. And that's why we have to know our history. And I learned that at Golden Gate Seminary, studying under Dr. Stanley Nelson, who told us that no theology develops in a vacuum. Whatever it is, look at what was happening all around it. It was reacting to something or against something. It could be good, but sometimes it might be bad. And so, again, I'm all for, for your podcast, I'm all for a personal relationship with Jesus. We have to have that. But when we know him, it transforms how we see everything else.
Well, and I might not have been clear. My statement of that's not bad theology was actually about the love God, love neighbor statement of Jesus, right? Like that's not bad theology. Jesus said it. Because I do think it's bad theology if you're not learning the gospel in community. You can't learn the gospel outside of community.
Right.
You can't unless you have people to learn reconciliation and forgiveness and grace with, right? I mean, my dad, when I hear him teach about the Old Testament mercy seat, right? He always explains it like this. He said it's why he does not like the way we typically teach about the propitiation of sin, because in the Old Testament, the propitiation of sin, big theology word there, in the Old Testament, that was justice and sin meeting. But the mercy seat, which symbolized propitiation, was instead of justice and sin meeting, and all of a sudden I'm only ashamed, or I'm only guilty, or I'm only going to be judged and annihilated, right? Instead of that idea, or get eradicated is what I mean by that. Instead of that idea, mercy collides. I love that you use the word collide in your title, because that's what happens, right? And we are a people who live under the benefit of mercy colliding where justice and sin were colliding. Like that's who we are. And so to hear us talk about stupid statements about that cry out against social justice ideas, we've got to wake up to the idea that justice and injustice, we can't sit by when injustice isn't either met with someone who stands up and speaks for the voiceless, or met with someone who stands up and brings mercy to the table.
Man,
we have to do that. And so that's what I love about every time I've ever heard you talk, Alan. I walk out of there thinking, okay, I'm better equipped to engage there. I'm better equipped to lean into that, to push back where it needs to be pushed back, but to even bring mercy to myself and my own racial biases and my own selfishness. So it's a big deal, man.
That's good. That's good.
Well, Jason, I studied under your dad one summer at seminary. He did a class on Revelation and eschatology, and I took a couple of these summer classes from that. I just audited. And so he had us reading the whole book of Revelation in context when we were going through the history and background. It was really good. And I got to Revelation 13 about the mark of the beast and about, buying and selling and, bowing the knee and all that. And I had, I had been taught like everybody else in my pre-trib, predispensational or dispensational pre-trib, a rapture, premillennial view about, one day you'll get the 666 on your forehead but what it says is that if you bow before an economic system that requires fidelity and to turn against God and to worship this beast, this economic system, and if you bow the knee to that, you're taking the mark of it upon yourself. And suddenly I started thinking about all the years in the South where white business owners violated the Imago Dei, the image of God, and went along with a racist system and a racist structure, because if they didn't, they would not be able to buy or sell.
That's right.
And suddenly that whole mark of the beast took on a very different connotation for me, because this is throughout all of Christian history. And I'm not saying it won't one day happen in exactly the way that all the books and novels have said. I don't know. But for me today, I realize, if I ever make a decision or bow the knee about anything following the Lord, because I might not make money in the future, because I might not have prosperity, because my church might not grow, because if I take this stand, then I might lose people in the church, then how am I not bowing the knee to a system set up against God, right? And so suddenly that reframes the whole thing. Like, we can't wait to get this right, because as long as we're compromising, like whatever's true is true, right? And we should live that way. So yeah, I was sitting in that class in New Orleans Seminary, and all of a sudden my head exploded, and I'm like, wait a minute, this could actually apply to us today. It could have 1925. Yes. If you're a white business owner and you're serving black people around back, and you know it's wrong.
Done.
Yeah, you know,
man.
So
that's where like I insert like the reggae horns, like, burr, 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 like that was like that's good. That's good so perspective. Good. Sheesh.
I agree.
Now, I'm not saying that people weren't Christians. I mean, we can fall into deception, and all of us have blind spots. And so we need to have mercy and grace with people, because God saves us out of all kinds of things. But it should humble us, and it should cause us to really tremble before all this, you know?
Yeah. As we wrap this episode up, give us some takeaways of if someone's listening and they're like, okay, I hear you, Alan, and I'm where you were before you started that journey. I'm where you are. You know, this is my First Baptist moment, like you had when you saw that plaque on those steps, right? That this moment in American history for a lot of white leaders is that, or maybe it's someone of any color skin who's just saying, this is going to be so hard. What do I do now? Like, what's the next step I can take? Regardless of those perspectives, from your historical perspective, give us some insight. What do we do now?
You know, I ended up leaving my church in 2015, and I went to work on behalf of immigrants and refugees, because it was just a logical flow and conclusion. And I continued to work in Montgomery. I worked with the Montgomery Baptist Association as a missional strategist with them. I would host tours of people coming in. So I kept working on racial reconciliation, expanded it to how we treat immigrants and refugees. And, you know, last year when we had this surge of asylum seekers coming to the border, we had 1 million people come from all over the world to our borders begging for help. And the churches along the borders were receiving those people. ICE was processing asylum seekers. They were coming and declaring asylum. It was illegal to do so. So you had tens of thousands of people a day being processed at the border stations, and then being turned over to churches, where the churches were taking them in. The churches were totally overrun. They were turning their sanctuaries into receiving areas. I went to the border several times during that time period, met pastors who had turned their whole ministry over to helping these people. And I tried, with whatever little voice I had, begged evangelicals across the country. I helped reporters get stories. I wrote myself. I called people. I begged Southern Baptists, please, let's engage this, missionally. Let's send mission teams. Let's support these churches at the border that are receiving these people from all over the world. And I did research. Over half of them were claiming to be evangelical Christians when they came. They're coming from Guatemala and Honduras. These were our brothers and sisters in Christ. And we would not do it. Last year, we would not do it. And I was asking people, why won't we engage us? Why aren't we sending mission teams? Why aren't we sending caravans of supplies? I mean, I was down there, and I was with guys. We'd go to Walmart and fill up buggies of plates and cups and supplies. They're putting on their own credit cards and buying this stuff. Where were the rest of us? We see all of this politically, and we think, I can't even talk about, this is what I was being told, I can't talk about this in my church because people might think that I'm against the president. And so 1 million souls came to our border last year. And this wasn't about politics. It was about ministry. And so we say we're about the gospel, and we're not. We don't respond to the people coming to us begging for help. And so if you want to see where our hearts are, just look, how did your church respond last year? How did the people around you respond last year? And so what Zechariah 7 says is that God tells us to be kind, and to show justice, and to be merciful to the widow, the orphan, the sojourner, and the poor. And if you don't do that, you'll block up your ears, you'll turn a shoulder, and your hearts will become diamond hard. And then you will be turned over to the whirlwind. You'll be turned over, and you'll be scattered, and you'll lose your land. And so I'm looking at what happened last year. 1 million people came to us, and the church, by and large, took a pass because it was too hard. And then what's happened this year, right? 2020 has been the whirlwind. And I'm not trying to say judgment. I mean, I have no idea what God is doing. But I do know that when our hearts harden against the people that come to our doorstep, then we're not prepared for what comes next. So the biggest thing that I can say is keep your heart sensitive, keep it open, when there are people in your community. And what we found out when I was going to the border, we found out that one of the places from El Paso, Texas, where people were going to was Montgomery, Alabama. Now, then I contacted our ministry centers, the Baptist ministry centers with our association. We have 3 or 4 of them working with our churches. And I contacted them and I said, are you seeing people showing up from Guatemala? Because according to the results, the people coming from Guatemala, a big number of them are heading to Montgomery. And they said, yes, we've actually been seeing people showing up here emaciated, wiped out, sick, really thin from their journey. And I said, that's because they're coming up through the border. So they were coming to your towns. They were coming to Nashville. They were coming to Montgomery, Alabama. They were showing up for months on end, and our churches weren't aware of it, And so that's not this situation with what's happening, with the Black Lives Matter and with the racial, because that's been going on for a long time. But I'm saying again and again and again, we have opportunities to open up our eyes and to see who the Lord sends our way. And if we really believe Acts 17, that God is in charge of the movements of the people around the earth so that they'll seek him and reach out to him and find him, then we can recognize that we're on the receiving end of that. Like, we should be welcoming people, and we should also be aware of the people in our own communities who are hurting and who are burdened. So the biggest thing that I can say to do is to have that private relationship with Jesus, that we talked about, that actually means that you love your neighbor and you love your perceived enemy. And go to Philippians 2:1-11 and see what Jesus did for us and what we're to do for others. And if you start there, then you open your eyes and you say, what is right in front of me? What's local schools, what's happening with broken communities and people's lives, and you open your eyes up, God will show you what to do. I don't ever tell anybody exactly what to do. I don't know, but I do know that Jesus is the answer, but it's Jesus applied into these things, not just get saved and go to heaven, then everybody will be changed. You don't have to worry about it. We actually have to live it out, so that's my, again, long answer to a short question. So
that's good. Well, Alan, we greatly appreciate your time. This is, we know that obviously you're busy, and not only that, you're 3 hours behind us, 2 hours behind Jason, but you took the time, and we greatly appreciate it. Man, if people wanted to follow you on Twitter or Instagram or anything like that, where can they find you?
Yeah, that's where I do most of my stuff, just as far as commenting on things and trying to point to solutions. But ALAN L Cross on Twitter, at Alan L Cross, and I'm on Facebook too. I do some stuff private with my family, but then I'm actually going to start. I know this is airing before this, but Monday night, the 29th, I think, of June, I'm going to start a Facebook Live going through this book. From 7 to 8 o'clock Pacific time. So if you guys want to join on, or, it'll be 9 or 10 o'clock your time, but I'm going to start with the SBC resolution against racism in 1995 and the apology for that. And then we'll work our way each week. So I'll probably be doing that through the summer.
Wow. Okay.
That'll be public on Facebook Live. So
I'm blown away again. Transparency, my bias. I'm just like, man, this guy here, there's so much that I can learn. Even as he talks, man, you've done the work. You've got the receipts, and like I said, I'm gonna purchase your book. We can find it on Amazon. When Heaven and Earth Collide, Racism, Southern Evangelicals, and the Better Way of Jesus. I'm, like I said, really looking forward to digging into that. So, man, again, thank you for your time, Alan. We greatly appreciate it. And as always, we want to thank you to our listeners for listening to us. Here at the Recon Convo. Remember, you can connect with us on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter under the Recon Convo. You can also stay connected with us through our website, reconciliationconversation.com, or feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel under No More Night Media. Alongside my friend Jason Dukes, my name is Derrick DeLain, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you next time. Peace out.